Hey there, horror fans, and welcome back to Real Talk Horror. This is the podcast where we sink our teeth into the spookiest, creepiest, and most iconic films that keep us awake at night, and maybe even make us double check and lock on our doors. I'm your host, Josh Bell, and today we're stepping into that unsettling world of John Carpenter with his 1995 remake film, Village of the Damned. Now, if you're a Carpenter fan, and let's be honest, who isn't? You know his career is filled with unforgettable films like Halloween, The Thing, and They Live. But Village of the Damned is a bit of an outlier. This movie marks the end of what I call Carpenter's Phase 4, a period where his work became a little more experimental and at times polarizing. What's fascinating about Village of the Damned is how it blends Carpenter's horror expertise with a sci-fi edge, all wrapped in his signature style. While it may not be his most celebrated film, it's definitely one worth dissecting, and that's exactly what we're doing here today. So what makes this movie special? How does it fit into Carpenter's broader legacy? And why should Village of the Damned be on your radar as a horror fan? Stick around, and we'll dive into all of that and more. First though, let's take a step back and see where this film fits in the timeline of Carpenter's incredible career. Now, John Carpenter. His name is one that's practically a genre in itself. If you're even remotely into horror, you know his work. This is the man who gave us Halloween, the perfect shoestring budget terror horror slasher that redefined the entire genre. He followed it up with The Thing, redefining sci-fi horror with groundbreaking effects and paranoia-inducing storytelling. And then there's They Live, a film that's as much a social commentary as it is a cult favorite. Carpenter wasn't just making movies, he shaped how we were experiencing horror. By the time we hit 1995, though, Carpenter was in a transitional phase. The early 90s saw him experimenting more, and while some of those experiments paid off, in the mouth of madness anyone, others divided fans and critics. This is the era where his films weren't always embraced right out of the gate, but they still carried his unmistakable touch. That brings us to Village of the Damned. This film is a remake of the 1960 British classic, and Carpenter uses it to put his own spin on some big, unsettling ideas: alien invasions, societal breakdowns, and the fear of the unknown, or more specifically, fear of the other. Now, I'll be upfront. Village of the Damned isn't in the same league as Halloween or The Thing in terms of cultural impact. But what it lacks in that iconic status, it makes up for in its layers. This is Carpenter taking a story that's already eerie and injecting it with his unique style, his music, his framing, and his ability to keep you on edge. So is it perfect? No. Is it fascinating and worth a closer look? Absolutely. So let's break down why, starting with the story. Let's dive into the creepy world of Village of the Damned. Here's the setup. Small, idyllic town of Midwich is hit by one of the strangest events you can imagine. Out of nowhere, every single person in the town collapses, unconscious for several hours. It's eerie, unsettling, and completely unexplained. When the townsfolk finally wake up, everything seems fine, until a group of women discovers they're mysteriously pregnant. Fast forward, and the children born from this bizarre event are anything but ordinary. They all share the same unnervingly characteristics: stark platinum blonde hair, hypnotic, piercing eyes, and an intelligence level that's terrifying. But there's something else about them, something colder, more sinister. These kids are connected in ways that defy logic, and their motives? Well, let's just say they're far from innocent. Village of the Damned explores some heavy themes that feel right at home in Carpenter's filmography. Paranoia, survival, and the slow unraveling of societal norms are all on display here. Carpenter has always had a knack for pulling back the curtain on humanity's fragility when faced with the unknown, and this is no exception. It's like he took his fascination with human vulnerability and gave it a sci-fi edge. The cast here is another standout element. Christopher Reeve plays Dr. Alan Chaffee, a local physician who becomes kind of the moral center of the story. And this was one of Reeve's final roles before his tragic accident, and his performance is grounded, heartfelt, and deeply human. Qualities that are essential when everything around him feels alien and terrifying. Opposite him is Kirstie Alley as Dr. Susan Werner, a government agent with her own agenda. She brings an edge of secrecy and authority that keeps you guessing about her true intentions. Together, these two characters anchor the film and provide both the emotional core and tension as they navigate impossible moral dilemmas. So you've got an eerie setup, chilling kids, and a cast that delivers. It's classic Carpenter, no doubt about it, but with a distinctly sci-fi twist. Let's take a closer look at the themes and how they tie into Carpenter's larger body of work. Let's start by pulling back the curtain and dig into the making of Village of the Damned. With a budget of $22 million, it wasn't a blockbuster by Hollywood standards, but it wasn't an indie shoestring production either. It landed right in what at the time was that mid-tier range where creativity often has to stretch every dollar, and that's a balancing act Carpenter knew very well by this stage of his career. And filming wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The story's supernatural elements required some intricate visual effects, especially when it came to depicting the children's otherworldly abilities. You know, those piercing stares and moments where the kids seemed to exert their will on the townsfolk. Well, getting those sequences to look believable, especially in the mid-90s, was no small feat. While effective for the time, the effects haven't really aged perfectly, but they still pack an eerie punch when viewed through the lens of Carpenter's storytelling style. One of the fascinating aspects of Village of the Damned is Carpenter's level of involvement. As usual, this wasn't a project where he just sat in the director's chair. He was deeply embedded in the film, shaping the story, crafting the music, the score, composed this time with collaborator Shirley Walker, is quintessential Carpenter. It's atmospheric, haunting, and steeped in that signature synthesizer-heavy sound that we've come to associate with his films. You could say the music really enhances the tension in a way only Carpenter can. And the cast, as we talked about with Christopher Reeve and Kirstie Alley, there's also a great role by Mark Hamill in here. Seeing Luke Skywalker in a completely different role is wonderful. And then there's the children. Lindsay Hahn, who plays Mara, the unofficial leader of the eerie brood, is especially frightening. Her performance toes that line between unsettling and downright terrifying, which couldn't be an easy feat for a young actor. The other children also bring an unnerving precision to their roles, and they amplify the film's creepy factor. But like we said, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Carpenter was open about the challenges he faced behind the scenes, particularly in this case with studio interference. He mentioned in interviews that his creative control was limited, and it's clear that some of his bolder ideas may have been scaled back to appease the powers that be. It's a shame, really, because you can feel the tension between Carpenter's vision and the constraints imposed on him. Even with those hurdles, though, Village of the Damned stands as a testament to Carpenter's resilience as a filmmaker. Despite the challenges, his fingerprints are all over this movie, from that haunting score and the unnerving atmosphere. But let's take a closer look at how his signature style shines through, even under that pressure. What makes Village of the Damned unmistakably a John Carpenter film? Well, whether you're watching Halloween, The Thing, They Live, there's always that signature Carpenter touch. That blend of visual, narrative, and auditory elements that turn even the simplest scenes into something tense and unforgettable. While Village of the Damned may not hit the iconic status of those earlier works, it's a film where his stylistic trademarks are on full display. Starting with his framing and visual composition. Carpenter has a knack for making spaces feel alive and filled with tension, and this is no exception. Take the scenes with the children. The way he frames them, often clustered together with those piercing, emotionless stares, creates a claustrophobic feeling. It's like they're silently taking up more space than they should, even though they're physically standing still. Carpenter leans heavily on symmetrical framing in these moments, and it gives the children an unnervingly calculated and unnatural presence. It's a subtle visual way of reminding us that these kids aren't like the rest of us. Lighting, another standout aspect. Carpenter's use of sterile, clinical lighting throughout the film adds to that sense of unease. Midwich is a town where everything looks too neat, too perfect, even as things begin to spiral out of control. This chaos works brilliantly to contrast with the escalating tension. The bright, even lighting, the children's school scenes, for example, is a deliberate choice. It feels cold and detached, mirroring the children themselves. It's a far cry from the moody, shadow-filled aesthetic of Halloween or The Fog, but it serves the story about as effectively. Then, of course, the music. Carpenter's scores have become legendary. But what's unique about Village of the Damned is how he blends his signature style with more orchestral elements, thanks to his collaboration with Shirley Walker. The combination gives the film an ominous vibe that really complements the story. The synth brings that classic Carpenter edge, unnerving, minimalist, relentless, while the orchestra flourishes add a layer of grandeur and some menace. Think about the way the music builds during the children's episodes, when their collective power is unleashed. The score doesn't just underscore the action, it actively manipulates your emotions and creates a sense of dread before you even see what's coming. It's pure Carpenter, using sound to keep you on edge, making you feel like something terrible's just around the corner, even if it's not. Carpenter's pacing is another hallmark of his style, and Village of the Damned may not be as much a slow burn as Prince of Darkness and The Thing. It still knows how to take its time building tension. He lets the story breathe, slowly ramping up the stakes as the children's true nature reveals itself. This deliberate pacing gives the film an unsettling rhythm. There are moments you think you're safe, only for something small but significant to tip the balance again. And now let's talk about how Carpenter uses space and silence to create fear. In Halloween, it was the emptiness of the suburbs. The Thing, it was the isolation of Antarctica. Here, it's the eerie normalcy of Midwich. The town feels just a little too quiet, a little too still. Carpenter, a master of turning ordinary settings into breeding grounds for paranoia, does it again here. Those long, empty streets and perfectly manicured lawns make you feel like danger is lurking, even when there's nothing happening. And finally, we do have to touch on the film's narrative structure. Carpenter doesn't rely on any cheap jump scares or complicated, overly done twists. Instead, he crafts a story that slowly peels back layers, revealing more about the children and the moral dilemmas faced by the townsfolk. It's restrained, methodical approach, and it feels very Carpenter. Even when dealing with a remake, he manages to inject his own flavor, balancing homage with innovation. So while Village of the Damned might not be Carpenter's most celebrated work, his fingerprints are definitely all over it. From that unnerving framing to the atmospheric score, that deliberate pacing and the layered narrative, it's classic Carpenter through and through. And let's be honest, oftentimes even lesser Carpenter is still an amazing way to make audiences squirm in their seats. When Village of the Damned hit theaters in '95, it did what most Carpenter films do. Not a lot. It struggled to find its audience and was met with mixed reviews from critics. For many, it felt like it was quite the step down from Carpenter's earlier classics, The Thing and Halloween. But again, the thing about Carpenter's films is they have the incredible ability to age like fine wine, finding new life and appreciation long after their initial release. Over the years, Village of the Damned has developed a small, loyal following. And it's not just Carpenter diehards, though they're certainly a big part of it. There are fans that have come to admire the film for its thematic depth, for its unsettling atmosphere, and its role as the transitional piece in Carpenter's career. The movie came at a time when Carpenter was experimenting, stepping away from straightforward horror he was known for and leaning more into sci-fi hybrids. You'll see shades of this transition in Prince of Darkness, They Live, but Village of the Damned feels like it's bridging the gap between Carpenter's signature style and his willingness to take risks in his storytelling. When it comes to his legacy, the influence of Village of the Damned isn't as loud or obvious as some of his more iconic works, but it's definitely there. The film taps into one of horror's most enduring fears, the idea of losing control over society, over our own communities, even over our children. That fear of the societal collapse, of the fabric of human connection unraveling, it's something you see echoed in later films. Think about movies like The Faculty or The Amazing Children of Men. While they don't draw directly from Village of the Damned, you can see how Carpenter's exploration of alien infiltration and human fragility left its mark. You see it in those other stories. Another lasting impact is the way the film plays with moral ambiguity. Carpenter doesn't give us easy answers. He never does. Are the children inherently evil? Or are they victims of their own alien nature? And what does it say about us as humans that the only solution the townspeople can imagine is violence? These are questions that'll stick with you, and they add a layer of complexity to what might otherwise feel like a straightforward sci-fi horror movie. That complexity is something Carpenter fans always appreciate, even if mainstream audiences don't quite get it at the time. And not forget the performances from Kirstie Alley to Christopher Reeve to Mark Hamill and especially Lindsay Hahn as Mara. They still mostly hold up. And of course, Village of the Damned has its flaws. It'll never be celebrated as any of his movies between the late 70s and all through the 80s. But it's a movie that'll grow on you, especially if you're willing to dig into the themes and consider it in the larger context of his entire career. It's a film that quietly asks big questions about humanity, morality, and survival, while still delivering those unsettling moments that Carpenter is so good at crafting. Now, it didn't make a huge splash, but it still earned a place as a fascinating, if underrated, entry in Carpenter's filmography. And it's proof that even when Carpenter isn't at the top of his game, he's still pushing boundaries and leaving his mark on the genre. And in a way, that makes it enduring. Let's take a moment to dive into what really makes Village of the Damned a fascinating piece of horror storytelling. One thing that stands out, one particular sequence, and probably sticks with you after the credits roll, is how the children respond collectively to threats. You'll know the one I'm talking about. Those piercing, glowing eyes. Carpenter uses this visual cue to perfection, building tension to a breaking point. The glowing eyes aren't just unsettling, they're an immediate signal that the children are something beyond human, something unnatural. What makes the scene work so well is that it isn't just an eerie glow. It's the way Carpenter frames them. There's a precision to the way he captures their collective movements, how they're always in sync, always like a hive mind. It's this deeply unnatural and profoundly unsettling thing. Then, when we pair that with the sharp, deliberate editing, those quick cuts between the children staring and their victims succumbing to their mental control, that's horror gold. Those bits, Carpenter knows how to amplify that tension, and those sequences are what make your skin crawl. But what really elevates this film and could have brought it to a whole different level is the moral ambiguity. Are the children the villains, the victims, or are they something else entirely? Something that defies the simplistic labels? And that's the big question, isn't it? On one hand, these kids are terrifying. They wield an unthinkable power, and they seem to lack any empathy or moral compass that we associate with humanity. Their actions are calculated, they're cold and brutal. But then you're reminded that they didn't choose this. These children were brought into the world under bizarre, traumatic circumstances. They didn't ask to be different, to be feared, or to become symbols of an otherworldly threat. That complexity forces us, as a viewer, to grapple with our own feelings about them. And that's where this film really could have shined, because it makes you uncomfortable. Not just because of the horror on screen, but because of the questions it asks. How far would you go to protect your town, your community, your species? And at what cost? Are the adults justified in their actions? Or are they letting fear override their humanity? Take Dr. Chaffee. He's arguably the heart of the film, and his internal conflict embodies the moral tug-of-war. He sees the children for what they are, a potential threat. But also, he recognizes their innocence. His role as both a protector and a reluctant adversary gives the film an emotional depth that really resonates. And Kirstie Alley's Dr. Susan Werner adds another layer of that moral complexity. Her character's government-backed approach to controlling or exploiting the children reminds us of humanity's darker impulses. It's not just the children who are morally ambiguous. The adults aren't exactly paragons of virtue either. And then the themes that Carpenter weaves throughout. The fear of the other, front and center. It's a theme that's been explored and exploited in countless sci-fi and horror films. But Carpenter adds a unique spin by blurring the lines between who the other really is. Is it the children with their alien-like abilities? Or is it the adults whose fear drives them to acts of violence and betrayal? And that question really lingers and makes the film feel maybe more like a psychological horror at times than a straightforward sci-fi thriller, or what it could have been. And then there's the question of agency. The film subtly explores who has control over their own actions, over their future, over the narrative itself. The children's hive mind abilities strip away agency of those around them, but their own lack of choice in their creation and purpose makes them victims in their own right. It's a cycle of powerlessness, and it leaves everyone feeling vulnerable. What sets it apart from the rest of Carpenter's body of work? It's that willingness to live in those gray areas. It's not just a story about creepy kids with glowing eyes. It's a story about fear, control, and what happens when those forces collide. And it doesn't deliver the same visceral thrills as Halloween or The Thing, but it offers something different. It's an unsettling exploration of morality wrapped in that Carpenter style. And that's what makes it worth revisiting all these years later. So where does Village of the Damned fit into John Carpenter's legacy? Well, for me, it's not Halloween, it's not The Thing, and it won't make it to the top of any best of Carpenter list. But it's thought-provoking and still very much worth the watch for fans of Carpenter's style. There's a lot to appreciate here, even if it doesn't hit any iconic highs of his other works. Carpenter's knack for creating atmospheric tension is front and center, and his exploration of moral ambiguity is something that makes the film stand out. The film has a unique kind of eerie charm, blending horror and sci-fi in a way that feels familiar but unsettling, and the thematic depth here, especially surrounding fear, control, and the idea of other, gives the film more layers than your typical horror flick. But, and this is important to note, it's far from perfect. The pacing here feels uneven. The atmosphere, though thick with tension, some of the character development feels underwhelming. Carpenter's signature touch is still there, but the film suffers from creative limitations, especially with the interference that he faced from the studio. It's not his most polished film. It's not his most exciting. It still has something to offer. The ending is a little too sudden, not really thought out all the way. But that being said, I would give Village of the Damned a 6 out of 10. Not Carpenter's best, but it's still a fascinating piece in his body of work. It's a movie that, despite flaws, invites you to think about it long after you've watched it. I still remember it. And in a world of horror films that can sometimes feel shallow and formulaic, that's something I respect. If you're a fan of John Carpenter's films, especially his more experimental works, this is worth checking out. It won't blow you away the way The Thing or Escape from New York did. It won't have you rocking out like you would watching the Plymouth Fury crash into somebody and Christine, but it'll give you a unique window into a very specific moment in his career. And who knows, you might find yourself revisiting it more than you think. If I catch it on or I'm flipping around and I can't find anything, I will watch it. Now, next time, we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to kick off phase 5 of our Carpenter breakdown, tackling some more of his polarizing works, starting off with Assault on Precinct 13, going way back to closer to the beginning, his second film. So make sure you tune in for that. It's a pretty wild one. As always, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Village of the Damned. If you've seen it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think it's a hidden gem? Do you agree it's a bit of a miss in Carpenter's filmography? Feel free to share your opinions on social media and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. And again, our social media is at Real Talk on Instagram and Threads. We only do a couple. And you can email us therealrealtalk@gmail.com. But come back next time. We'll talk real soon. And remember, stay spooky and keep watching those films that give you chills. We'll see you soon.